My sister filed a sworn complaint against me with the state licensing board exactly 22 days after I signed the largest contract my firm had ever seen. I know it was 22 days because I had the notification timestamped. I kept everything timestamped after that. I didn't say a word at the disciplinary hearing. Not one. I sat at the defense table with my hands flat on the cool laminate surface, while she stood at the podium in the navy blazer she reserves for funerals and formal accusations, and I let her talk. My mother sat in the gallery behind her and refolded a tissue into smaller and smaller squares. I watched the board chair pull up the supplemental file my attorney had quietly submitted that morning, go completely still. The kind of still that happens when a body forgets it's supposed to be breathing. And ask for a recess in a voice that had lost most of its authority. My sister smiled at the table across the aisle. She thought the recess meant the board needed time to compose itself before ruling in her favor. She had no idea the ruling had already been written. She'd written it herself, in a document she filed 6 months earlier under oath, and every lie inside it was now sitting on that table like a lit fuse she couldn't reach. The complaint arrived on a Tuesday in March, delivered by a process server to my office on the 14th floor of a glass building in uptown Charlotte. I had just come off a call with the County Transit Authority. My firm had been awarded a $4.2 million contract to redesign 3 pedestrian overpasses along the light rail corridor, the kind of project that moves a small firm from promising to permanent. My assistant set the envelope on my drafting table without a word because the return address made her nervous. I read it, standing up. My sister had submitted a 15-page sworn complaint to the North Carolina Board of Architecture, alleging that my professional engineering certification was fraudulently obtained, that I had been sealing structural drawings without valid licensure for 3 years, and that I posed an active public safety risk to anyone who used the structures my firm had designed. The document had footnotes, exhibits, legal formatting she hadn't done herself. Beneath her signature were 2 supporting declarations, my mother, my father, both signed under penalty of perjury. I set the document face down on my desk. I sat in my chair and watched the second hand move around the analog clock I keep above the whiteboard. A habit from graduate school, when I trained myself to give hard feelings a fixed amount of time before shifting into problem-solving mode. 4 minutes. Then I picked up my phone and called my mother. She answered on the second ring. I told her I'd received the filing. She didn't say she was sorry. She said she'd been worried about my clients for quite some time. She said she and my father had grown increasingly concerned that I was in over my head, and that if something were to fail, a structure, God forbid, something with people on it, it would devastate what remained of the family's professional standing. My father had spent 35 years building a reputation as a civils engineer in this state. She hoped I could find it in myself to understand that they were acting out of love and responsibility. I told her I understood exactly what they were doing. I hung up. I drove to their house in Myers Park that evening. My mother was in the kitchen when I walked in through the back. She still keeps a spare key under the fern by the door, has kept it there for 20 years. My father was in his study. My sister was sitting at the kitchen island with a glass of white wine and an expression of carefully arranged neutrality on her face, which told me she had not expected me to show up in person. I put the complaint on the island in front of her. I asked her one question, and only one. What was her firm's current billing exposure on the Mecklenburg County School renovation project? The wine glass stopped halfway to her lips. She set it down very slowly and told me I was being paranoid and that her finances were none of my concern. My mother stepped between us and began talking about family unity, about handling difficult things privately, about how we were not enemies. My father appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at the document on the counter, looked at me, and walked back into his study without a single word. That silence told me more than anything he could have said. I drove straight from their house to a strip mall in Concord to meet a forensic accountant named Gideon. He had a reputation for finding things that people had convinced themselves were permanently buried. I had used him twice before on litigation support work. He ordered black coffee and a slice of lemon pie and did not offer small talk. He laid out the picture in under 20 minutes. My sister's construction management firm was facing a federal audit on the school renovation. The Inspector General's office had flagged significant discrepancies between billed labor hours and crew manifests on site. The exposure estimate was north of $800,000. If the audit found her liable, her operating accounts would be frozen pending recovery proceedings. And here was where it clicked into something cold and clear. Under state law, if my architectural license were suspended or revoked, my active contracts would be placed under court supervision. A court-appointed administrator would be given temporary authority to manage my project files and my firm's escrow accounts, which held substantial funds paid in advance by the County Transit Authority for work in progress. My sister had already drafted a petition to be named that administrator. Gideon had a source inside the county clerk's office and a photocopy of the provisional filing to prove it. She was going to hollow out my firm to fill the hole in hers. I sat with that information in the parking lot of the diner for a long time before I drove back to my office. I went into the drafting room, pulled up the main workstation, and opened my project archive. CAD software embeds metadata in every saved file, a digital chain of custody that records the author ID, workstation ID, and timestamp of every revision, down to the minute. I had 4 years of documented structural work sitting in that archive, each file a verifiable record of who produced it, when, and on what machine. I pulled the metadata logs. Everything was exactly where it should be, stamped with my credentials and my active N-key ARB certificate numbers for every reporting cycle without exception. Then I did something I hadn't planned to do. I cross-referenced my sister's recent permit submissions. Her construction firm had filed permit drawings on 2 projects in the past 18 months. I had heard her mention them at a family dinner the previous Thanksgiving, passing references she clearly didn't expect me to examine. Permit records in this county are public. I pulled both sets. The file naming convention was mine. Not similar. Not a coincidence. Identical, down to the specific alphanumeric sequence and hyphenation format I had developed in 2019, as a personal organizational system for complex multi-phase projects. I had never published it, never taught it, never shared it with anyone outside my own firm, and there it was, sitting inside permit drawings that my sister's firm had submitted and sealed under a different engineer's credentials. I stared at the screen for a while, then I called my attorney. She came in at 7 the next morning. I walked her through everything. The metadata trail, the naming system, Gideon's evidence of the court filing, the timeline of the audit, the permit drawings. She took notes in a small leather notebook, and did not interrupt me. When I finished, she looked up and said we had more than enough. She said the strategy was straightforward. We would not file a countercomplaint. We would not tip our hand. We would walk into the hearing and let my sister present her case brick by brick, and then we would dismantle the foundation all at once. She said she had been practicing for 19 years, and she had never been more confident. The hearing was on a Monday morning in a beige conference room, on the 4th floor of a state office building in Raleigh. 7 board members behind a long table. A court reporter in the corner. Fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. My sister presented first. She was composed and specific, and she had rehearsed. She talked about public safety, with the conviction of someone who had told herself the story enough times to believe it, and I sat across the room and kept my face absolutely neutral and let every word enter the official record. My mother testified under oath that she had personally suspected, years ago, that my original licensing application contained falsified documentation. She said this with tears running down her face and her hands folded in her lap. She said she had hoped she was wrong. She said a mother's heartbreak was indescribable. She pressed the folded tissue to the dry corner of her eye. I did not look away from her while she spoke. I watched her perform grief for 7 strangers who held my career in their hands. And I kept my hands flat on the table, and I kept my breathing steady, and I let her hang herself with every word she chose to put on the official record. Then my attorney stood up. She submitted the metadata report first. 40 pages of digital forensics prepared by a certified examiner that traced every structural drawing my firm had produced across 4 years, with each file's author credentials cross-referenced against my unbroken NC-ARB certification history. She submitted the naming convention analysis, entered my original 2019 documentation into the record, and then, with the measured calm of someone placing the final piece on a chessboard, presented the permit drawings from my sister's 2 construction projects alongside a direct comparison of the naming structures. The board chair asked my sister to explain the convention used in those drawings. My sister said her drafting team handled that level of detail. The board chair asked which specific team member had developed the system and when. My sister said she would need to review her internal records. The board chair asked her, gently, to describe the logic behind the alphanumeric sequence. My sister opened her mouth, closed it, said she wasn't the technical point of contact for drafting standards. The board chair called the 15-minute recess. When the room reconvened, the atmosphere had changed in a particular way. It changes when people in authority have consulted privately and reached a conclusion they haven't announced yet. The board chair sat down, straightened the papers in front of her, and told the room that the supplemental technical evidence established a clear and unbroken record of my licensure status and the validity of every seal I had applied over my career. She announced that the complaint was dismissed. She announced that the sworn declarations submitted in support of the complaint, both of them, were being referred to the State Attorney General's office for review of potential perjury. She looked at my mother when she said that last part. My mother's face went empty, not sad, not angry, empty in the specific way of someone whose script has run out and who hasn't written anything past this page. My sister pushed back from the table so hard, the chair legs screamed against the floor. She started talking very fast. The forensics examiner was biased. The evidence had been manipulated. This was not what was supposed to happen. She looked at my mother and said this was not what they had agreed on. And then she seemed to hear herself, in a room with a court reporter, taking down every syllable, and she stopped. The board chair told her she was free to leave. My attorney slid the restraining order across the table. Pre-signed. Pre-notarized. My sister looked at it, looked at me for the first time since she'd walked in, looked at me the way you look at someone you've failed to correctly account for, and picked up her bag and walked out. My mother followed without speaking. I stayed in the room for a few minutes after everyone else left. The court reporter was coiling her equipment cable. The water pitcher sat untouched in the center of the table exactly as it had at the start. I thought about last summer my sister and I drove out to Lake Norman when we were teenagers, and sat on the hood of her car, and she told me she was proud of me for getting into the engineering program at State. She'd meant it then. I was almost sure she had. I let that thought exist for a moment, and then I let it go, and then I stood up and shook my attorney's hand, and walked out of the building into a May afternoon that smelled like cut grass and rain somewhere to the west. 3 weeks later, Gideon called me. My sister, following the AG referral, had retained defense counsel. In the process of cooperating with investigators on the federal audit, a gesture her attorney had apparently advised as a show of good faith, the full scope of the school project overbilling had been documented and confirmed. The repayment order came in at $940,000. Her firm's accounts were frozen immediately. What I had not anticipated was the collateral dimension. My father had co-signed as a financial guarantor on 2 of my sister's firm instruments 3 years earlier. A family favor, he'd called it at the time. A gesture of confidence in her business. When her accounts were frozen, his exposure became real and urgent, and he called me for the first time in 4 months. I let him finish. He asked if I would consider submitting a character reference to help contextualize the situation for investigators. He said that whatever had happened between us, I surely didn't want to see my sister face consequences that were disproportionate. I told him, very calmly, that I had a board hearing transcript, a court reporter's record, and a state referral letter documenting exactly what his signed declaration had contributed to a coordinated effort to revoke my license and eliminate my livelihood. I told him I had nothing further to offer. I wished him well, and I meant it in the way that you mean something you have released all attachment to. I hung up. I have not spoken to any of them since. People sometimes want to know how I moved past it without more visible wreckage on my end. They expect something more dramatic, prolonged grief, the kind of healing that has stages and milestones and a recognizable arc. What actually happened was much quieter. I went back to work. I hit every deadline on the transit project. I hired 2 additional structural engineers before the end of the year. In October, I drove out to Asheville alone and spent 3 days eating well and sleeping 9 hours a night, and felt, for the first time in as long as I could specifically remember, like the air around me was genuinely clean. No static, no low-grade vigilance, just air. That was it. That was the actual shape of recovery for me. But I've thought carefully about what made it possible to walk away intact, without spending years inside the wreckage. And I think it comes down to 3 things I had to consciously unlearn. The first was the belief that family is owed loyalty it hasn't chosen to earn. We are raised to treat blood as the one unconditional bond, the relationship that persists independent of behavior, the debt that cannot be discharged. But loyalty is not a birthright. It is built through specific, repeated, chosen actions over time, and it can be forfeited through specific, repeated, chosen actions over time. When I separated the biological fact of my relationships from the question of what those relationships had actually demonstrated across years of real behavior, the loss became much more legible. You cannot genuinely grieve something that was never consistently present. What I had mourned, I came to understand, was a version of family that had existed mainly in my own hopeful imagination, sustained by evidence I had been carefully selecting, and the rest I had been carefully ignoring. The second thing was the illusion of the golden child's security. My sister had been the family's designated success story since we were small. The one whose choices were publicly co-validated, whose trajectory was treated as the family's proof of concept. For a long time, I believe she experienced that status as solid ground. What became clear in that conference room in Raleigh, and became undeniable when my father pointed her toward the investigators, with a shaking hand to protect his own co-signed assets, was that her status had been conditional the entire time. The moment her usefulness to the family structure became a liability instead of an asset, the support evaporated. Immediately, without ceremony, without apparent conflict. The golden child is not loved in the way we mean when we use that word. The golden child is managed. Their role is to reflect well. When they stop reflecting well, the investment is liquidated. I had spent years in the painful position of the one who was not preferred, and I had experienced that as a wound. I came to understand, sitting in that beige conference room, watching my sister look for help that was not coming, that it had always been a form of freedom in disguise. The third thing is the hardest to articulate, but the one that determined everything. When someone attacks you, especially someone close to you, especially someone who is supposed to be on your side, the overwhelming instinct is to defend yourself loudly, to explain, to prove, to force them to see the truth and feel the appropriate weight of what they've done. That instinct, if you follow it, will cost you the fight. The people who came after my career were not operating from a place that was capable of receiving explanation. They were operating from fear and self-interest, and those 2 things do not respond to argument. They respond only to consequence. I won because I stayed quiet long enough for the consequences to become visible and undeniable on the official record. Not because I am patient by nature, I am genuinely not. But because I understood that my job was not to make them understand who I was. My job was to document everything, secure the evidence, and step out of the way while they talked themselves into exactly the position I needed them to be in. The last time I went out to Lake Norman, it was November. Cold and gray, the water pewter-colored, the trees stripped back to their architecture. I sat on the hood of my car and watched a heron stand at the waterline for a long time without moving, the way herons do, and then open its wings without any run-up and lift into the air as though the motion required no effort at all. I thought about what I would have lost if I had reacted instead of waited. The contract, the firm, the license that represents 10 years of work, and the memory of a 22-year-old, studying load distribution at midnight in a library carrel, because she found genuine beauty in the way forces resolve through a well-designed joint. I would have traded all of it for the chance to make people understand who I was. People who had already decided, people for whom my being understood was never the point. I drove back to Charlotte and reviewed the drawings for the first overpass span. The geometry was clean, the load calculations were right. I approved the file, applied my seal, and sent it to the county by 5 o'clock. There are things worth protecting with everything you have. The work that is genuinely yours. The license you earned in rooms where no one helped you. The quiet life you are building on ground you leveled yourself. Learn which things those are. Hold them without announcing them, and do not let anyone who has not earned access to your peace convince you that their crisis obligates your surrender.